Irashaimase! Hello and welcome to Fataris' Kitchen. I'm your host, Chef Fataris. It's time once again for Shoot 'em Up Saturday, and on the menu this Saturday we have Thundercross, another awesome Konami arcade classic. What kind of taste will it have? Let's get cooking and find out. From developer Konami, Thundercross released to arcades in 1988. It would see a release among several different arcade collections, most recently the Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection. Though the version we're looking at today is the Arcade Archives version, which just released for the Nintendo Switch in February of 2021. Although it was previously available on the PlayStation 4, though just the Japanese PSN, releasing in 2017. Thundercross is similar to other Konami shoot-'em-ups of the era, such as Gradius and Life Force. Though it does differ in setting and gameplay, if you like titles like that and other Konami shoot-'em-ups, then this is one that I can definitely recommend. And really, if you're a fan of classic shoot-'em-ups, this is one that should be on your radar. If you don't already have the Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection, then experiencing this Arcade Archives release is well worth it. Here at the main menu, we see that the game has 4 different ROM versions. The Japanese Old, the Japanese New, the North American, and the European. Of those, the North American is the most different, and we'll have a look at that one, but we'll start with a look at the Japanese version first. Starting up the game, we're taken right to the title screen, and it's great that it starts up that fast. Dropping credits in, we see one of the things that I really love about this game. The presentation really is wonderful in my mind, and I just love any shoot-'em-up that starts with us launching off of a carrier or a battleship, regardless of the type of ship that we're ultimately flying. It just helps really set the mood for me, myself. So, once we begin the game, one thing you might notice is the really awesome parallax scrolling that's going on in the background. So that was a relatively new technique in the era, 1988, and it was something that this game showed off in not all of its stages, but most of them. And that's part of the reason why I think it might have had an overall different setting, so it could kind of show off the planetary side of things. The gameplay itself is relatively standard horizontal scrolling shoot-'em-up. We only have the ability to fire, and unlike other Konami shoot-'em-ups of the time, the power-up system is more simplified. You don't collect these power-ups from enemies and then select your power-ups from a power-up bar. Rather, the enemies will drop a particular power-up that you pick up. If you let the power-up sit for an amount of time, it will cycle, and those power-ups do have, of course, certain effects. So the O is the most common, and that will give us options. It's possible for us to obtain up to 4 options. There's also an S, which is a speed power-up, and then there are 3 different weapons. The V for the Vulcan, B for the boomerang shot, and T for twin laser, which kind of acts more as like a rear fire, like a tail laser, as it fires both forward and backward. It definitely is useful, but situationally. And then once you've fully powered up, it's possible to obtain special power-ups that power up our options, like this flamethrower here, for example. So there is a power meter that meters out our usage. You can see there in the bottom left. And, well, the flamethrower is definitely my favorite of the 3. The other 2 being the macro laser, which is a large laser that fires out from the 4 options. And then also napalm, which is kind of almost, well, it's not quite a screen-clearing bomb, but it does provide quite a bit of explosion support throughout a particular portion of the screen. After you've used all the special power-up, we'll actually hold on to it for just a second. We've made it to the end of the first stage, and thus encounter our first boss. So one thing that's neat about the options in this version is you can control their distance from the ship. They're not always at a fixed distance, but we can increase the distance and, well, use them to maybe kind of even cheese a boss like this, attack them from above from relative safety, and you really want to use that for other enemies as well. quickly taken down this enemy, we've completed stage 1. And afterwards, we see another awesome little touch that I just love. So after you complete a stage, you land on this carrier and you move on to the next stage. So rather than show you the next stage in the Japanese version, we're going to change over to the English version. So I'll be back in just one moment. So here we are once again at the launch sequence, but this time of the North American version. Oops. So right off the bat, you can notice one particular difference. Well, actually a couple. For one thing, we're starting on what was the Japanese version, stage 2, but the North American version has it as stage 1. The title, the stages have actually been reordered for this particular release. But we also start with 2 options, and that holds true whether you're playing with 1 player or 2 players. And this game does support 2 players simultaneous, which is something I definitely appreciate. In addition to those changes, there's also only a single power-up you can pick as far as weapons are concerned. Gone are the boomerang shot, the twin laser, and the Vulcan. Well, the Vulcan is still here, of the Japanese version, and replaced solely by the Vulcan. And even when you fully power up your ships and the options, you don't actually gain the ability to get special power-ups like the flamethrower or the macro lasers, but that's instead replaced by a bomb that you have right from the get-go, the Little Baby, which is a wonderful name for a giant screen-clearing bomb. It's not as powerful as I would appreciate for such, but it does do a good job of dealing with smaller enemies as well as clearing the screen of bullets. So there is some other differences throughout the course of the gameplay that in some ways I feel make the English version more difficult. There are certain enemies that will appear that explode in shots towards the enemy, or rather explode in shots that fire towards you once you defeat them, including annoying like homing bullets and other changes like that. But because you aren't fully powered down every single time you die, in some ways it does make it an easier version of the game as well. So some things are more difficult, some things easier. It's kind of a tricky thing to consider. So we've arrived at the end of the first stage, and you can kind of see just how great the influence of the Gradius-style bosses are. This particular boss feels very much like a boss you would encounter in Gradius 2 or Gradius 3. And there's a neat little feature that the bosses also have. There's always that like crystal that comes in, joins with the boss, and then once you defeat it, the crystal leaves. With the exception of the last boss, which didn't really make a whole lot of sense to me. So, with the second stage down, or rather the first stage down in the North American version, we're taken to a stage we've already seen. So, I'll take a brief moment to finish this stage, and I'll rejoin you on the third stage of the North American version. Here we find ourselves at the beginning of the third stage in the North American version, which I believe the Japanese version is stage 4. So I really like this stage for a couple of reasons. First off, we've got this beautiful sunset background behind us. Another reason I like the stage is it's very reminiscent of those battleship stages from other shoot-'em-ups, which isn't the kind of thing you see as frequently in Konami shooters, but in titles like R-Types in particular, you see those kind of stages all the time, and it's really nice to see a different take on that stage. Throughout the course of this stage, you'll have enemies flying around and ultimately like joining this big battleship, and there's this wonderful section where the maw of the ship opens and closes allowing us to go in and fight the enemies inside, but then we have to back out because of, or there's these like sections here that open up. It's just a really neat fight overall. One problem that I think this game like does have is especially if you're playing two-player, but it definitely happens in single-player as well, is like certain sections do encounter more slowdown than others, especially if you're using a weapon like the Vulcan at full power. Still, overall, it is an enjoyable experience, and this particular stage is one that I am fond of. So let's talk a little bit about the minus and the negative flavors that the game has. So although it's not as big of an issue with the North American version, as you always start with a pair of options, the game still suffers from power down syndrome. It's not as big of an issue though, because unlike other Konami shoot-'em-ups of the era, it doesn't employ a checkpoint system. Rather, you just continue where you die. The exception being stage 7, where if you happen to run out of lives, stage 7 is the final stage. If you're not playing the North American version, then you will get a game over. You will not be able to continue the game on the final stage of the Japanese version. I'm not sure if that applies to the European version as well, though. Another like, this is like less of a major gripe, more of just kind of a personal like curiosity as to why things are as different as they are. Like, why in the North American version would you take out the other power-ups, and specifically the power-ups for having the full set of options and all the powers? There is still some really like neat things you can do, and in some ways the simplified power-up system of the North American version makes it the easier version to play, but some of the fun is gone of lacking of not having like the flamethrower or the other special weapons that you can obtain at that point. Even if you do have the little baby, which, you know, I do appreciate having the screen clearing bomb, as there's not a whole lot else to aid you with survivability. But on the plus side, I do love the pixel art and this beautiful like sunset that we have behind us with some different colors on ourselves and the enemies, as well as just a great soundtrack, really help add up to the biggest plus flavor, and that's just that classic Konami feel. So at the end of the day, this is definitely a shoot 'em up that I recommend you try, be it in the arcade archive version or in the anniversary, the Arcade Classics Anniversary Collection. Thunder Cross is one that is just an enjoyable classic shoot 'em up experience. Alright, well, that'll just about wrap it up for this week's episode of Shoot 'em Up Saturday. As always, I want to thank you so much for coming out and joining us, and I look forward to seeing you again next week.